behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, a secret has been eating away at the very foundation of the British monarchy for decades. What started as a forbidden love affair has now become the biggest crisis the royal family has ever faced. King Charles III, the man who waited 70 years to wear the crown, is about to make an announcement that will change everything we thought we knew about the royal family forever. They called it the love story of the century when Charles finally married his longtime love, Camilla Parker Bowles. But what if that fairy tale ending was built on the biggest lie in royal history? What if the woman who became queen consort has been hiding a truth so devastating that it could destroy the monarchy itself? In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, whispers have been growing louder. Palace staff speak in hushed tones about late-night meetings, secret phone calls, and a king who can no longer look his wife in the eye. Something has been discovered. Something that changes everything. The announcement that King Charles is about to make will shock the world, divide the nation, and leave Camilla facing a fate that no one saw coming. This is not just another royal scandal. This is the story of how one woman's biggest mistake brought down the walls of the most powerful monarchy on earth. What you are about to read is the true story of power, betrayal, and the devastating price of keeping secrets in the House of Windsor. Buckle up, because nothing will ever be the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle as King Charles III walked slowly through the East Terrace garden. His weathered hands, marked by age spots and years of public service, trembled slightly as he clutched a manila envelope that would change the course of British royal history forever. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did on this crisp autumn morning in October 2024. Inside the envelope lay documents that his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had placed on his desk just 3 days earlier with a grave expression and the words that still echoed in Charles's mind. "Your Majesty, I believe you need to see this immediately. It concerns the Queen Consort, and I'm afraid the implications are quite serious." Charles had ruled for just over 2 years since his mother's passing, and he had thought the biggest challenges were behind him. The public had gradually warmed to Camilla as Queen Consort. The Commonwealth realms had accepted his sovereignty, and even the most vocal Republicans seemed to have settled into a grudging acceptance of his reign. But now, everything was about to unravel in ways he could never have imagined. The king paused beside the rose garden that his beloved grandmother, the Queen Mother, had tended for decades. The irony was not lost on him that he was standing in the very spot where family secrets had been shared for generations, where confessions had been made and family crises had been navigated, but nothing in the long and tumultuous history of the House of Windsor had prepared him for this moment. The documents in the envelope contained financial records, correspondence, and sworn affidavits that painted a picture so shocking that Charles had initially refused to believe it. On day 6 hours, he had barely slept, barely eaten, and had avoided all contact with Camilla while he processed the magnitude of what he had learned. The revelation centered around events that had taken place during the mid-90s, during the darkest period of Charles and Diana's marriage. While the public was focused on the War of the Waleses, while newspapers were filled with stories of affairs and separations, Camilla had been conducting business that went far beyond the bounds of appropriate conduct for someone so close to the heir to the throne. According to the documents, Camilla had been secretly receiving substantial payments from foreign governments and private entities in exchange for information about the royal family's private affairs, upcoming announcements, and internal palace politics. The payments, totaling over £15 million spread across multiple offshore accounts, had continued even after her marriage to Charles in 2005. But the money was only the beginning of the scandal that threatened to engulf the monarchy. The documents also revealed that Camilla had been providing information about security arrangements, travel plans, and even details about the Queen's health during her final years. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications for national security. As Charles read through bank statements showing payments from sources connected to foreign intelligence services, media conglomerates, and private security firms, he felt his world collapse around him. This was not just a personal betrayal by the woman he loved. It was a betrayal of the crown, the country, and everything he had sworn to protect. The king's hands shook as he remembered the conversation he had shared with Camilla just 1 week earlier. As they walked through these same gardens, she had spoken about their future together, about the legacy they would build, about the stability they would bring to the monarchy after years of turmoil. Every word now felt like another dagger in his heart. The investigation that had led to this discovery had begun almost by accident. A routine audit of royal household expenses had uncovered some irregularities in payments to external consultants. When investigators dug deeper, they found a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and false identities that all led back to Camilla Parker Bowles. The most damaging revelation was that during the period immediately following Diana's death in 1997, when Charles was grieving and the monarchy was at its most vulnerable, Camilla had been selling information about the family's private reactions, their plans for Diana's funeral, and even details about how the young princes William and Harry were coping with their mother's death. Charles thought about his sons, about how they had finally come to accept Camilla as part of their father's life, about how William had walked her down the aisle at their wedding in 2005. The betrayal would devastate them all over again, reopening wounds that had taken decades to heal. The financial investigators had been thorough in their work. They had traced payments from Russian oligarchs who had wanted advanced knowledge of sanctions policies, from Middle Eastern governments seeking information about arms deals, and from American media companies paying premium prices for exclusive details about royal scandals before they became public. One particularly damning piece of evidence showed that Camilla had received a payment of £2 million just days before Charles's accession to the throne, apparently in exchange for information about which government ministers would be appointed to key positions in his new reign. Vatican policy. The buyer appeared to be a consortium of hedge funds looking to profit from advanced knowledge of policy changes. As the king walked back toward the castle, he could see palace staff going about their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. The gardeners were tending to the autumn plantings, security officers were conducting their regular patrols, and in the distance he could see tourists gathering outside the gates, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. None of them knew that within hours, everything would change. The woman they knew as their queen consort, the woman who had finally found acceptance after decades of public scrutiny, was about to face the greatest crisis of her life. And Charles, the king who had waited 7 decades to wear the crown, was about to make the most difficult decision in the 1,000-year history of the British monarchy. The envelope in his hands contained more than just evidence of financial crimes. It contained the power to destroy everything he had built with Camilla, everything they had overcome together, everything they had planned for their future. But it also contained evidence of a betrayal so profound that ignoring it would be a betrayal of his own coronation oath. As he approached the castle's ancient doors, Charles knew that the next few hours would determine not just Camilla's fate, but the future of the monarchy itself. The biggest mistake in royal history was about to be exposed, and there would be no going back. The king paused at the threshold, took one last look at the peaceful gardens where he had spent so many happy moments with the woman he loved, and stepped inside to begin the process that would change everything forever. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and the burden of truth had never been more crushing. Inside the castle, Camilla was having breakfast in the morning room, completely unaware that her carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down around her. She smiled and waved as Charles passed by the doorway, the same warm smile that had captivated him for over 50 years. In just a few hours, that smile would be replaced by shock, denial, and ultimately, the devastating realization that her biggest secret had finally been discovered. The biggest mistake in royal history was about to be revealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The grandfather clock in the blue drawing room chimed 11 times as King Charles III arranged the damning documents across the mahogany table where his ancestors had signed treaties, declared wars, and made decisions that shaped the course of history. Today, he was about to make a decision that would rival any of them in its historical significance. Camilla entered the room with her characteristic grace, wearing a navy blue dress suit that she had chosen for their planned visit to a children's hospital that afternoon. Her hair was perfectly styled, her jewelry modest but elegant, and her smile carried the confidence of a woman who had overcome decades of public scrutiny to finally claim her rightful place beside the king. "Darling, you look rather serious this morning," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I do hope everything is well. The staff mentioned you've been in meetings with Sir Clive all morning." Taiseo, up there. Charles studied his wife's face, searching for any sign that she knew what was coming. Her blue eyes held nothing but gentle concern and the warmth that had drawn him to her since their first meeting in 1970. For a moment he wondered if there had been some terrible mistake, if the investigators had somehow gotten it wrong. But the evidence was too comprehensive, Too detailed, too devastating to be anything but the truth. Camilla, he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I need to discuss something of the utmost importance with you. Dialography over the past 30 years. The past 30 years. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. So brief that someone who hadn't known her for half a century might have missed it entirely. But Charles caught it, and in that moment, he knew that she understood exactly what this conversation would be about. I'm afraid I don't understand, she said carefully, her voice maintaining its usual calm tone. What activities are you referring to? Charles reached for the first document, a bank statement showing deposits totaling over £3 million from sources that appeared to be shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He slid it across the table toward her, watching as her eyes scanned the figures and account numbers. These deposits were made into accounts under your control between 1995 and 1998, he said quietly. Tasting. The sources have been traced back to foreign governments and private intelligence firms. The payments coincided with several significant leaks of private family information during that period. Camilla's hands remained steady as she examined the document, but Charles noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that had always been her tell when she was processing something she hadn't expected. After what felt like an eternity, she set the paper down and looked directly at him. But Charles, I can explain this, she said, her voice taking on the same tone she had used decades earlier when explaining away phone calls from Andrew Parker Bowles during their affair. These are legitimate consulting fees. I did some work for various organizations during the 90s providing insights into British society and culture. It was all perfectly legal. Consulting fees, Charles repeated, sliding another document across the table. This one showed a payment of £1.5 million, dated just 3 days before Diana's funeral. What sort of consulting were you doing in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death that was worth this amount of money? For the first time since entering the room, Camilla's composure began to crack. Her fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit he remembered from their early relationship, and she took several deep breaths before responding. That was a difficult time for all of us, she said slowly. I was approached by several media organizations and research firms who needed help understanding the public mood, the family's perspective. I provided general guidance about British customs and traditions around mourning and state funerals. Charles felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. The woman sitting across from him had been the love of his life for over 5 decades, had stood by him through scandals and separations, had endured decades of public hatred to finally earn acceptance as his queen consort. And now she was lying to his face about something that threatened the very foundations of the monarchy. General guidance, he said, his voice growing colder. He reached for a folder containing printed emails and phone transcripts. These communications show that you provided specific details about William and Harry's emotional state, about their private conversations with me, about security arrangements for the funeral procession, and about the Queen's private feelings regarding Diana's death. Camilla's face had gone pale, but she maintained her defiant posture. I never compromised anyone's safety. Any information I shared was already going to become public knowledge eventually. Eventually, Charles repeated, standing and walking to the window that overlooked the courtyard where tourists were gathering for the changing of the guard, but not before foreign intelligence services could use it to their advantage. Not before hedge funds could profit from advanced knowledge of government policy changes. Not before the private grief of my sons could be turned into commodity to be bought and sold. He turned back to face her, and for the first time in their long relationship, Camilla seemed to realize the gravity of what she was facing. The walls of denial were beginning to crumble, and the weight of 3 decades of deception was settling on her shoulders. You received £2 million just days before my accession, Charles continued, placing another document on the table, in exchange for information about ministerial appointments and policy directions that you could only have known by listening to my private conversations with government officials. Charles, please, Camilla said, her voice starting to crack. You have to understand it started so innocently, during the worst years of your marriage to Diana. When we weren't sure if we would ever be together, I was approached by people who offered financial security in exchange for simple information about social events and family dynamics. Simple information, Charles said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Details about the Queen's health during her final years. Security protocols for state visits. Private family conversations about abdication discussions. Private details about Catherine's pregnancies before they were announced. Information about Harry's mental health struggles after his military service. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Camilla had been present for all of these private moments, had been trusted with the most intimate details of family life, and had apparently been cataloging and selling that trust for 3 decades. "I never intended for it to go this far," she whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "It started with just harmless society gossip, things that would become public anyway. But then they wanted more, and they offered so much money, and I thought about our future together, about having financial independence so I wouldn't be seen as a burden to the crown." Charles felt his heart breaking as he listened to her confession. This was the woman he had defied his mother for, had risked his relationship with his sons for, had endured decades of public criticism to marry. And she had been betraying him, betraying his family, betraying the crown itself, almost from the very beginning of their relationship. "The payments continued after our marriage," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even after you became Duchess of Cornwall, even after you were accepted into the family, even after you became Queen Consort. Why didn't you stop?" Camilla was crying openly now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "I tried to stop several times, but they said they would expose everything if I didn't continue. They had recordings of our private conversations, photographs from our secret meetings before our marriage, details about family finances that would have destroyed your reputation. So you chose to continue betraying us rather than face the consequences of your earlier betrayals," Charles said, the pain evident in every word. "For 30 years, Camilla. For 30 years you sat at our dinner table, attended our private family gatherings, held my grandchildren, and all the while you were selling our secrets to the highest bidder." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Camilla's quiet sobbing and the distant noise of tourists outside the castle walls. Charles looked at the woman he loved, the woman he had waited decades to marry, the woman who had just admitted to the biggest betrayal in the history of the British monarchy. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice broken and small. Charles walked back to the table and gathered up the documents that had destroyed their life together. "Now we discuss your fate," he said quietly. "And I'm afraid, my dear, that there are very few options available to us." The king looked at his queen consort, the woman whose biggest mistake was about to cost her everything, and prepared to make the most difficult decision of his reign. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. The Privy Council chamber had witnessed many crisis meetings throughout its centuries of service to the crown, but none quite like the emergency session that convened at 2 o'clock that same afternoon. King Charles III sat at the head of the ancient oak table, his face bearing the weight of a man who had aged years in the span of a few hours. Around him sat the most trusted advisors of the realm, each one struggling to process the magnitude of the crisis that threatened to destroy the monarchy. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, had spent the morning briefing each council member individually, watching their faces transform from skepticism to shock to grave concern as the evidence was presented. Now, as they gathered in formal session, the full scope of Camilla's betrayal was laid bare for collective deliberation. "The evidence is incontrovertible," began Sir Clive, his usually steady voice betraying the strain of the day's revelations. "Has admitted to receiving payments totaling over £27 million across 30 years in exchange for information about private royal family matters, state security, and government policy." Lord Geet, the former private secretary to Queen Elizabeth II and current member of the Privy Council, leaned forward with the gravity of someone who had navigated royal crises for decades. "Your Majesty, the implications extend far beyond personal betrayal. We're looking at potential charges of treason, violations of the Official Secrets Act, and breaches of national security that could destabilize our relationships with allied nations." The Attorney General, Victoria Prentice, had been summoned from an important court hearing and still wore her barrister's robes as she delivered her devastating legal assessment. "The evidence suggests criminal activity spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving foreign entities that could be classified as hostile to British interests. The Crown Prosecution Service will have no choice but to pursue charges once this becomes public knowledge." King Charles listened to each advisor's assessment, feeling the walls of his world closing in around him. The woman he loved, the woman he had waited decades to marry, had not only betrayed him personally but had committed crimes against the state that he now ruled. Irony was crushing in its completeness. What are our options? The king asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. Sir Clive consulted his notes, though Charles suspected his trusted advisor had memorized every terrible detail. Option 1. We attempt to handle this privately. The Queen Consort could quietly retire from public life, perhaps citing health concerns, and the matter could be dealt with through private legal channels. And the likelihood of that remaining private? Charles asked, though he already knew the answer. Minimal, Your Majesty, replied the communications secretary, Tobin Hammond, who had been hastily recalled from a family vacation to manage what was certain to become the biggest royal crisis in modern history. The investigation involved multiple law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and foreign governments. Contact. The chances of containing this information are essentially zero. Lord Geit nodded grimly. The minute this becomes public knowledge, every payment, every piece of information sold, every conversation betrayed will be scrutinized by the media, by Parliament, and by foreign intelligence services. The damage to the Crown's reputation would be incalculable. Option 2, Sir Clive continued, is immediate action. The Queen Consort announces her retirement from royal duties and divorces proceedings begin immediately. B. This allows the Crown to distance itself from her actions while demonstrating that no one, regardless of position, is above the law. The word divorce hung in the air like a death sentence. Charles had endured one devastating divorce already, had seen how it damaged his sons and his reputation, had sworn that he would never put the monarchy through such turmoil again, and yet here he was, facing that exact scenario once more. The constitutional implications are staggering, added the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, who had joined the meeting via secure video link from Downing Street. Prime Minister Sunak has been briefed and is deeply concerned about the national security aspects of this case. There are questions about what information might have been shared with foreign governments about defense strategies, economic policies, and intelligence operations. Charles thought about the countless state dinners, official visits, and private briefings that Camilla had attended over the years. She had been present for conversations about military deployments, economic sanctions, and diplomatic negotiations. The scope of potential damage was virtually unlimited. Your Majesty, said Lord Geit gently, there is also the matter of the line of succession to consider. While the Queen Consort's actions don't directly affect the succession, the scandal could damage public confidence in the monarchy to such a degree that serious questions about abdication might arise. The suggestion struck Charles like a physical blow. He had waited 70 years to become king, had finally found his role after decades of preparation, and now he faced the possibility of having to abdicate because of his wife's betrayal. The nature of the tragedy was almost unbearable. The international implications are equally serious, added the Foreign Secretary's representative. Several of the payments appear to have come from sources connected to nations we currently have sanctions against. There will be questions about whether state secrets were compromised, whether our allies can trust us with sensitive information, and whether the Queen Consort had access to information that could have influenced foreign policy decisions. As the afternoon wore on, each advisor painted a picture that grew progressively darker. The financial investigators had uncovered evidence suggesting that Camilla had not acted alone in the later years of her scheme. They had identified at least 3 other individuals within the royal household who appeared to have been recruited to provide additional information in exchange for substantial payments. The rot appears to go deeper than initially thought, Sir Clive reported, consulting a folder that had been delivered during the meeting. We've identified payments to a senior footman, a lady-in-waiting, and possibly someone within the Royal Protection Unit. The entire household may be compromised. Charles felt physically sick as the implications sank in. And the people he trusted with his life, with his family's safety, with the most intimate details of royal existence, had apparently been selling that access to foreign bidders. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. What about William and Harry? Charles asked quietly. How do we tell them that their stepmother, the woman they finally accepted after Diana's death, has been selling information about their private lives for 3 decades? The room fell silent at the question that had been weighing on everyone's minds. Prince William, as heir to the throne, would need to be briefed immediately, but the impact on both sons would be devastating. They had already endured the trauma of their mother's death and the years of scandal that followed. Now they would learn that their father's second wife had been profiting from their pain. Prince William should be briefed tonight, suggested Lord Geit. As heir apparent, He needs to understand the constitutional implications and help make decisions about how to proceed. Prince Harry's situation is more complex given his current relationship with the family and his residence in California. The king realized that his son Harry, already estranged from the family and living in self-imposed exile, would likely see this revelation as vindication of his decision to leave royal life behind. The irony was bitter. Harry had fled the constraints and betrayals of royal life, only to discover that the biggest betrayal had been happening right under their noses for decades. As the meeting continued into the evening hours, Charles found himself thinking about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she would have handled such a crisis. She had navigated the abdication crisis, the Diana years, and countless other challenges with dignity and steadfast resolve. But even she had never faced anything quite like this. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said as the formal presentations concluded, "ultimately this decision rests with you. Whatever you choose, we will support and implement to the best of our abilities. But you should know that delaying action will only make the eventual consequences more severe." King Charles looked around the table at the faces of the men and women who had dedicated their careers to serving the crown. They were looking to him for leadership in the darkest hour of his reign, expecting him to make decisions that would protect the monarchy even if they destroyed his personal happiness. "I need the night to think," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. "Tomorrow morning I will announce my decision regarding the Queen Consort's fate." As the council members filed out of the chamber, Charles remained seated at the ancient table where monarchs had made history-altering decisions for centuries. And in less than 12 hours, he would join their ranks by making the choice that would define his reign and determine whether the monarchy could survive its biggest scandal ever. The biggest mistake in royal history had been exposed, and now the king, who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown, would have to decide whether love or duty would prevail in the most important decision of his life. The clock tower of Windsor Castle struck midnight, as King Charles III stood alone in the private study that had served as his sanctuary for over 2 years of his reign. The room was illuminated only by the flickering flames in the fireplace and a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across the walls lined with books, family photographs, and portraits of his predecessors. In 12 hours, he would face the British public and announce a decision that would forever alter the course of the monarchy. On his desk lay 2 prepared statements, each representing a path that would define his legacy as king. One statement announced Camilla's immediate retirement from royal duties due to health concerns, buying time for a private resolution while hoping against hope that the scandal might somehow remain contained. The other statement was far more decisive and infinitely more painful, the announcement of immediate divorce proceedings and Camilla's complete removal from royal life. Charles had not slept for over 40 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images from their decades together during his marriage to Diana, their wedding day at Windsor Guildhall in 2005, Camilla's tears of joy when the public finally began to accept her, and her pride during his coronation when she was crowned Queen Consort beside him. All of it now felt tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. A soft knock at the door interrupted his agonized thoughts. "Come in," he called softly, expecting to see Sir Clive with another urgent update. Instead, Prince William entered the study, still dressed in the formal attire he had worn to an emergency briefing earlier that evening, oddly, taking the chair across from the king's desk. His face bore the same grave expression that Charles remembered from the dark days following Diana's death, when William had been forced to mature far beyond his years. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow's announcement." Charles studied his eldest son, the heir who would one day face his own impossible choices as king. William's marriage to Catherine had brought stability to the royal family after years of scandal, and their children represented the future of the monarchy. Now that future was threatened by the actions of the woman William had reluctantly come to accept as his stepmother. "How are you processing this?" Charles asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. William was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together, as he chose his words carefully. "I keep thinking about all the private conversations she was present for. Family dinners where we discussed Catherine's pregnancies before we announced them publicly. Conversations about George, Charlotte, and Louis. Discussions about Harry's struggles with military service and his eventual decision to leave royal life." The pain in William's voice was evident as he continued. "She was there when we talked about grandmother's declining health. She knew about the concerns regarding her final months, about the plans for her funeral, about the succession arrangements, And apparently, she was selling all of it. For Charles felt the weight of his son's words settle heavily on his shoulders. This was not just about his personal betrayal. It was about the violation of his children's trust and the exploitation of his grandchildren's private lives for financial gain. "There's something else," William said quietly. "The investigators briefed me on some additional findings. There are indications that information about the children's security arrangements, their school schedules, and even details about their medical care may have been compromised. The safety of your grandchildren may have been put at risk for money." The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. He thought about little George, Charlotte, and Louis, innocent children who had done nothing more than be born into a life of public service, and the idea that their safety had been compromised for financial gain filled him with a rage deeper than any he had ever experienced. "What do you think I should do?" Charles asked his son, knowing that William's perspective as both heir and father would be crucial in making this decision. William stood and walked to the window, looking out over the castle grounds where his children played during family visits. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who understood the weight of the crown even before wearing it. "Father, I've spent my entire life watching this monarchy weather crises. I've seen how grandmother handled the scandals of the 90s, how she managed the Diana years, how she preserved the institution even when it seemed like the public had lost faith completely." He turned back to face his father, and Charles saw in William's eyes the same steely determination that had characterized his mother's reign during its most challenging moments. "But this is different," William continued. "Personal indiscretions, or failed marriages, or even tragic accidents. This is about someone who was trusted with the most intimate secrets of the royal family, systematically betraying that trust for personal profit. If we don't act decisively, if we're seen as putting personal relationships above the integrity of the crown, we risk losing the public's trust permanently." Charles knew his son was right, but the personal cost felt unbearable. "She's been my companion for over 50 years, William. Through all the difficult times, through the public hatred, through the struggle to gain acceptance. I love her." "I know you do," William said gently. "And I know this is destroying you. But you're not just Charles who loves Camilla. You're King Charles III, and your first duty is to the crown and to the people who look to the monarchy for moral leadership. If you protect her from the consequences of her actions, what message does that send about justice and accountability?" The father and son sat in contemplative silence as the implications of William's words settled between them. Charles understood that his choice would set a precedent for how the monarchy handled crises for generations to come. Future kings would look back at this moment and judge whether he had chosen personal loyalty over institutional integrity. There's also Harry to consider," William added reluctantly. "When this becomes public, as it inevitably will, he's going to see it as vindication of everything he said about the corruption and secrets within the royal family. If we're seen as covering this up or minimizing it, it will only strengthen his position and further damage our reputation." Charles thought about his younger son, living in California with Meghan and their children, having walked away from royal life claiming that the institution was fundamentally flawed. Harry's criticisms had been painful but relatively contained. This scandal would give him ammunition for years of additional attacks on the monarchy's integrity. A second knock at the door announced Sir Clive's arrival with the latest updates from the overnight investigation. "Your Majesty, Prince William," he said, his exhaustion evident despite his professional demeanor. "I'm afraid there are additional developments you need to be aware of." Charles steeled himself from more bad news, wondering what else could possibly make the situation worse. The Metropolitan Police have indicated that they will need to interview the Queen Consort as part of their investigation into potential violations of the Official Secrets Act, Sir Clive reported. Additionally, the Financial Crimes Unit has identified evidence suggesting money laundering through multiple offshore accounts. The criminal implications are now unavoidable. The news settled over the room like a death shroud. Any hope of containing the scandal or resolving it privately had just evaporated. Camilla would face criminal prosecution whether Charles protected her or not. Protected. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive continued, "the palace press office has been fielding calls from international media outlets for the past 3 hours. Someone has leaked information about the investigation. We estimate that we have perhaps 6 hours before this story breaks publicly, with or without our official statement." Charles felt the last vestiges of choice slipping away from him. The decision was no longer whether to act, but how quickly and decisively he could move to protect the monarchy from the complete devastation of being caught off guard by media revelations. "Father," William said quietly, "the choice has been made for us. Now we can only control how we respond to it." King Charles III looked at the two prepared statements on his desk, knowing that only one path forward remained. The biggest mistake in royal history was about to become public knowledge, and the king who had waited 70 years to wear the crown would have to sacrifice the woman he loved to save the institution he had sworn to protect. The weight of duty had never felt heavier, and the price of the crown had never been more clear. In a few hours he would announce Camilla's fate, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning of November 15, 2024, dawned gray and cold over London, as if the weather itself reflected the gravity of what was about to unfold. At precisely 10 o'clock, every major television network, radio station, and digital news platform in the world prepared to broadcast what would become known as the most shocking royal announcement in modern history. King Charles III stood behind the podium in the throne room at Buckingham Palace, wearing the deep navy military uniform that had become his signature for the most formal occasions. His face bore the weight of sleepless nights and impossible decisions, aged beyond his years by the events of the past week. Behind him, the ancient portraits of his predecessors seemed to watch as he prepared to make a statement that would redefine his reign and reshape the monarchy forever. The assembled media representatives sat in stunned silence, having been summoned for what they had assumed would be a routine royal announcement. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to a moment that would be remembered alongside the abdication of Edward VIII and the death of Princess Diana as one of the most consequential events in royal history. "Ladies and gentlemen," the king began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to reveal, "appear before you today to address a matter of the utmost gravity concerning the crown and the trust placed in the royal family by the British people and the Commonwealth realms." The cameras captured every subtle expression, every pause, every sign of the internal struggle that had brought him to this moment. Around the world, viewers who had tuned in expecting routine royal news instead witnessed history unfolding in real time. Over the past week, investigations conducted by various law enforcement agencies have uncovered evidence of serious criminal activity involving a member of the royal family. These investigations have revealed a pattern of behavior spanning 3 decades that represents a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in the crown. The room remained absolutely silent except for the quiet whirring of cameras and the scratching of pens on notepads as journalists struggled to process the implications of the king's words. The evidence shows that Queen Consort Camilla has, over a period of 30 years, systematically received payments totaling over £27 million from foreign entities, media organizations, and private individuals in exchange for confidential information about royal family affairs, government policy discussions, and matters of national security. The bombshell statement landed with the force of an earthquake. Several journalists audibly gasped, while others began frantically typing on their devices to alert their newsrooms to the magnitude of the story breaking before their eyes. Charles paused for a moment, his composure wavering slightly as he prepared to deliver the most personally devastating part of his statement. This information included private family conversations, details about the health and well-being of family members, security arrangements, and sensitive discussions about government policy that took place in the Queen Consort's presence. Around the world, television producers scrambled to alert their breaking news teams, while newspaper editors cleared their front pages for what would become the story of the century. Social media platforms crashed under the weight of millions of users attempting to share and discuss the stunning revelation. The scope of this betrayal extends to information about my sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, including details about their private struggles, their security arrangements, and their family lives. Information about my grandchildren, innocent children who deserve protection from such exploitation, was also compromised for financial gain. And the personal pain in the king's voice became evident as he spoke about his family. But his royal training allowed him to maintain his composure as he delivered the devastating details that investigators had uncovered. Perhaps most seriously, the evidence suggests that information shared during the final years of my mother's life, including details about her health, her private thoughts about the succession, and arrangements for her funeral, were among the subjects of these financial transactions. The mention of Queen Elizabeth II sent a collective shudder through the assembled media. The beloved monarch's private moments had been exploited for profit, adding a layer of sacrilege to the already overwhelming scandal. The investigation has also revealed that the Queen Consort was not acting alone. Several members of the royal household staff have been identified as participants in this scheme, raising serious questions about the security and integrity of our entire operation. Charles took a deep breath before delivering the conclusion that he had agonized over throughout the sleepless nights since the discovery. After careful consideration and consultation with senior advisors, I have determined that the Queen Consort's actions represent such a fundamental breach of trust that her position within the royal family can no longer be sustained. The moment of truth had arrived, and the world held its breath as the king announced the fate of the woman he had loved for over half a century. Effective immediately, Camilla Parker Bowles is stripped of her title as Queen Consort and all associated honors. I have begun divorce proceedings, and she will no longer participate in any royal duties or represent the crown in any capacity. All security protection and financial support from the Crown Estate will cease immediately. The finality of the announcement hit the room like a physical force. Cameras captured the shocked faces of seasoned royal correspondents who had covered decades of royal scandals but had never witnessed anything approaching this level of institutional devastation. Furthermore, the king continued, I am directing that all assets acquired through these illegal payments be surrendered to the Crown and subsequently donated to charities supporting victims of fraud and national security violations. Charles paused to look directly into the cameras, speaking not just to the assembled media but to the millions of people around the world whose trust in the monarchy had been shattered by these revelations. The British people in the Commonwealth realms placed their trust in the Crown to uphold the highest standards of integrity and service. That trust has been violated in the most serious way possible, and I take full responsibility for allowing this situation to develop under my watch. The admission of royal fallibility was unprecedented. Never before had a reigning monarch accepted personal responsibility for such a comprehensive institutional failure. I want to assure the public that this investigation is ongoing, and law enforcement agencies have my complete cooperation in pursuing criminal charges against all individuals involved in this scheme. No one, regardless of their position or relationship to the crown, will be protected from the consequences of their actions. The king's voice grew stronger as he spoke about accountability, drawing on reserves of strength that had sustained the monarchy through centuries of challenges. The royal family will emerge from this crisis stronger and more transparent than ever before. New protocols for security clearances, financial oversight, and access to sensitive information will be implemented immediately to ensure that such a betrayal can never happen again. Charles looked once more at the assembled media, knowing that his next words would define his reign for future historians. I understand that these revelations will shock and disappoint many people who have supported the monarchy and believed in the integrity of the royal family. I ask for your patience as we work to rebuild the trust that has been broken and to demonstrate through our actions that the crown remains worthy of the faith you place in it. The king stepped back from the podium, having delivered the most devastating royal announcement in modern history. The woman he had loved for over 50 years was now facing criminal prosecution and complete exile from the life they had built together. The monarchy itself faced questions about its survival that hadn't been asked since the abdication crisis of 1936. As the king left the throne room, the assembled media erupted into a frenzy of activity. Around the world, breaking news alerts flooded television screens and mobile devices. Social media platforms struggled to handle the unprecedented traffic as millions of people shared their shock, anger, and disbelief at the revelation that the Queen Consort had been selling royal secrets for 3 decades. Within hours, Camilla Parker Bowles was photographed leaving Clarence House with a small suitcase, her royal protection detail conspicuously absent, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses as she began her journey into exile. Person in Britain, then slowly earned acceptance and finally love from the public, was now facing the consequences of the biggest mistake in royal history. The announcement that had shocked the world was complete, but the aftershocks would reverberate for years to come. The monarchy faced its greatest crisis since the English Civil War, and King Charles III, the man who had waited 70 years to wear the crown, now faced the challenge of his life, saving the institution he loved from the betrayal of the woman he had loved even more. The biggest mistake in royal history had been exposed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The crown endures, but at a price that no one could have imagined possible. The king had chosen duty over love, and history would judge whether that choice was enough to save the 1,000-year-old institution that had just faced its darkest hour.